This was one of my favorite toys as a child. It's seen better days. Before it broke and thus became a child's toy, it was also the ultrasonic remote control for a 1975 Zenith console television. It belonged to my grandparents and weighed approximately 700 pounds. You may be asking yourself, what's an ultrasonic remote? Why on earth is someone talking about one 40 years after they were last made? Let's find out, and then gruesomely replace its innards for our own purposes. Brace yourselves, because what you're going to see is a remote designed to control modern home automation systems, get Frankenstein into the most stunning and futuristic-looking body that the mid-1970s had to offer. This is my first video about a recent project, and as a result has actual video of the build process to make it more compelling. At least I hope so, because this is somehow even more niche than the previous video. Why do this? It's an even more reasonable question this time. It was partially because I fell down an eBay rabbit hole late one night and found an identical 70s remote in great condition, and partially because I had a couple gripes with the home automation remote. Sometimes that's how my projects happen. Two completely unrelated neurons in my brain connect at just the right time, and I come up with a thing I want to exist. That process does sometimes take a while, though. Between having the initial idea and buying the vintage remote, 2 years went by before I got this project done. I'd end up finding the roughed up original, which you saw earlier, while cleaning out my parents' basement a few months after I finished this project. Now, before we get into my Frankenstein idea and the build process, I want to talk about these remotes a bit, because each of them use fairly unusual technology. I think that drove their design in each case, and it's also why I put them together. Unlike the garden variety infrared remotes that you're probably used to, these remotes use ultrasonic and radio frequency technology, respectively. To cut this section down to a reasonable length, it boils down like this. To communicate, infrared uses light you can't see. Ultrasonic uses sound you can't hear. And radio frequency uses radio waves humans don't even have a sense for. In this corner, we have the vintage Zenith remote. Very large, uses ultrasonic. Previous versions of this remote actually had no batteries or electronics at all, just switches that hit tiny little hammers onto aluminum tubes that made the right sounds, almost like a tiny handheld xylophone. This one uses a big 9-volt battery and a lot of circuitry to do the same thing electronically and support more buttons. In this corner, the relatively modern AOTech mini remote. Incredibly tiny, uses radio frequency or RF. This is really nice because it's omnidirectional. You don't have to point it at a device for it to work. And it has great range and low interference, but it requires more power. In contrast, you've probably had a more common infrared remote run for a decade on 2 AA batteries. The low cost and minimal power needs for infrared remotes are why these are the most common type you see. With that context in place, here's how this idea came about. I got the Z-Wave remote in about 2014 and used it for a while, but became frustrated with it for a few reasons I alluded to earlier. First, it's really, really tiny. This means if you put it on a nightstand, a cat may use it as a gravity experiment. It may get knocked off easily when you put a glass of water down, and it's very hard to locate because it can get wedged in tiny little nooks and crannies. Not great for a device you really want to be able to reach over and use when half asleep. Second, because of the size, the buttons were not very ergonomic. They're small and positioned closely together, which again makes precision operation a bit tough. Third, because of its power needs, they gave it a rechargeable battery, which is great. But they also gave it a mini, not micro, mini USB connector, which I just don't have handy in any of the places I charge stuff. I thought about desoldering the connector and replacing it to solve this, but it's such a tiny and dense board I was concerned I'd destroy it in the process. So after finding a nice copy of my childhood toy on eBay, I thought, why not put a wireless charging coil on the tiny battery-hungry Z-Wave remote, and put all of that inside of a super cool looking case with big, easy-to-hit buttons that can't get knocked over or lost as easily. All I'd have to do is put it on a wireless charging pad overnight once every 6 weeks or so, and I would have all of the technological and ergonomic benefits that I wanted. And it would look like what I thought the future would as a kid. $12 later, it was mine. And that's how the idea came about. Whew, we're finally at the build process. Kind of. Once the outer remote arrived, I was very excited at the memories it brought back. So excited, in fact, that I did nothing with it for nearly 2 years. Yeah, it was 2020. Life happens. After finally getting back in the swing of these projects, I decided to dust this one off again, and I was done within about 2 days. There's a lesson there. Here's how the build process went over those 2 days. First, I pried open the Z-Wave remote, and then removed the bounce-back silver domes it uses to trigger button presses. I sacrificed a mini USB cable and soldered its connector onto a wireless charging coil I got off eBay. Now I had all the parts I needed prepped, and it was time to hook everything up. First, I hooked up wires to each of the spikes that run to each button on the Zenith remote. Each button has a wire, and then they all share a common ground. These wires can simply be connected to each of the flat pads of copper on the Z-Wave remote circuit board. I tested as I went, and everything worked as expected. In order to prevent things from shaking around in the cavernous belly of the new body, I used everyone's favorite, I'll redo this later adhesive, hot glue. The last thing to do was to replace the mesh cover with some leftover diffused white acrylic, so that the LEDs from the inner remote would be visible and dust and dirt couldn't get inside. Put it all together, and you have this highly functional, ergonomic, and aesthetic beauty. It can control anything connected to my home automation system. And I mean anything. Not only do I not have to find an uncommon charging cable, I don't have to find one at all. It works on every wireless charging device I've tried. It's chunky enough that it's very easy to locate. It can even stand up on its end to take up less space. It hits all the things I'd hoped for. I used to see this remote as straight out of Star Trek, and point it at lights and stuff and pretend it could control anything with magic future powers. And now it kinda can. So what did I learn during this process? First, don't wait to find out how bad things could be. It could be a really tough challenge, or it could end up being a lot simpler than you originally thought. Hesitating to find out doesn't change anything. Once I got the Zenith remote, I waited a long time to take it apart, assuming that what I wanted to do would present a whole bunch of new problems I didn't want to deal with. And it ended up being incredibly easy. Second, trust your gut on liking an idea. This is one of my favorite things I've ever made, and I use it all the time. It seemed a bit far-fetched to pull it off, and that's why it feels magical. The difficult stuff tends to be more meaningful when it's done. I want each of these videos to include appreciation for those who inspired or made them possible. In this case, I have to thank my partner Meg for supporting me and carving out the time and space to do these kinds of projects in the first place, and to make these videos. So, what's next from here? I think now that I've done a retrospective on a project from my past and a build video from the present, maybe it's time for a cautionary tale. Get a pair of cut-proof gloves, people. They're a lot cheaper than an ER visit. Ask me how I know. Or I'll just tell you in the next video. If you take nothing else from this, I think it should be to take notes whenever a crazy idea comes to mind. You don't have to do every single idea you come up with, and it may take you a while, but when you finally go for it, the pieces also may come together a lot faster than you expect. Till next time, thanks for watching.